panelists. I'm really glad that you've taken up our invitation to join us, because she's talking, as you know, about extremism and the media. Dr. Shedd's currently Associate Dean for Administration at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. She teaches many courses, particularly a course on terrorism, extremism, global conflicts and ideologies. She holds a PhD and an MS in conflict resolution and analysis from George Mason, and her research includes work on the relationship of media to conflict, specifically focused on media coverage of terrorism and the role of women in political violence. She's directed the Benjamin Franklin Summer Institute, bringing students together for training and exchange programs, and also she's been instrumental in shepherding ESCA's efforts to increase distance education, and she's overseen a wide range of innovations in experiential and service learning. I won't go into all her publications, you can look them all up. They're all very interesting. She'll be telling us more about her work tonight. I'd like to thank MEDAC, with whom we have a lovely working relationship. I know there are many students from MEDAC in the audience here tonight, and I know that she's one of your lecturers, and it's wonderful that you share your lecturers so very generously with the foundation, and that way the public in general can benefit from their experience and their knowledge. But before introducing Dr. Shedd, it's my great honor to introduce Her Excellency, the President of Malta, who will address you. Thank you.
Good evening, Dr. Shedd, faculty members, students, dear friends. It is truly my pleasure to welcome you to another public lecture, facilitated by the President's Foundation for the Wellbeing of Society, together with the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution of George Mason University. I would like to take this opportunity, in fact, to thank George Mason University for the growing collaboration with the President's Foundation for the Wellbeing of Society. It is with satisfaction that I note that over the years, interest for these events is always increasing. This is evidence of the longing we feel as people of goodwill for sustainable and effective ways to make solidarity and peace a way of life. Today's lecture is particularly important as it will tackle the question of extremism in the media. I would like to take a moment to offer some reflections on the need for the media to become a powerful voice for peace and to help promote the creation of a culture of peace. We all know the saying that information is power. The way information is disseminated, interpreted, and presented has a significant impact on the way people talk about the events and situations unfolding around us. Many a time, perceptions are changed through the influence of the media. This fact places a tremendous responsibility upon those who communicate information. It is so essential that information is transmitted in respectful ways. The media can be catalysts, effective catalysts, to encourage a harmonious environment in which our communities can thrive. Freedom of expression is not only an essential factor for a vibrant media, but most importantly, freedom of expression is a fundamental human right and a founding value for truly transparent and inclusive democracies. Freedom of expression should be a celebration of cultural and social diversity. It honors the individuality of our lives, while at the same time, it should provide a medium through which humanity can connect and engage with one another in respectful ways. When our societies lack diversity and mutually respectful sources of information, this creates social tensions. People become easier to manipulate. Humanity becomes defenseless against the voices of extremists who offer deceptive promises of stability and truth, and in the process are reinforcing the prejudices and discrimination, which our societies once hoped would be a thing of the past. We must remember that in such circumstances, even the most seemingly developed and advanced nations are at risk when they fail to hear the enriching diversity of voices which constitute a healthy democracy. The importance of freedom of expression in our media is mentioned specifically in the United Nations Millennium Declaration. The declaration states the need, and I quote, to ensure the freedom of the media to perform their essential role and the right of the public to have access to information, end quote. We are consumers of media, but also, through digital platforms, people are becoming collaborators in the transmission of information. The correct use of digital media is so essential. Therefore, I believe that we all have a role to play to challenge the threat of hate speech. We can do this by creating environments of equilibrium and balance within our communities and our societies. We must strive for true information, where no voice is shouted down, drowned out, or ignored. It is crucially important in our times of uncertainty that we find the right balance to prevent the harm that can be caused by unrestricted speech, while also honoring freedom of expression. I am convinced that the full participation of our media can foster a positive peace approach, which will not only diminish the threat of violence, but also will promote a culture of solidarity, peace, and well-being. I believe that we must call for our news outlets and media portals to become spaces of connection and of healing. This is perfectly expressed in today's newspaper editorials, where the Times of Malta, the Malta Independent, and the Malta Today showed a strong and historical example of connecting together to share one powerful message of peace. We should be encouraged by this example of 3 major and independent English language newspapers in Malta to continue promoting conflict-sensitive and peace-oriented approaches through the media. Peace is a strong word. Peace means something powerful. Peace is the objective, but also the process by which we must transform ourselves, our communities, and our societies. By making the choice to live in this way, with dignity and in solidarity with each other, we shall truly build a united culture of peace, of benefit to both present and future generations. I urge you to use and not to abuse this democratic freedom of expression in your lives, and to be catalysts within your communities for the promotion of peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for those very inspiring words. Now, Dr. Julie Shedd, I'm going to raise this because you're lovely and tall. There you go.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm very happy to be here, Your Excellency. Thank you for the introduction, and Ruth, thank you for the invitation to be here. Thanks also to the staff of the President's Foundation for the Wellbeing of Society. This has been really wonderful to work with you all in the run-up to this presentation. Some of you may know that I'm here in Malta this week as part of a dual degree program that we run at George Mason with the University of Malta, where we're training students in conflict resolution in the context of Mediterranean security. And quite a few of those students, I think, are here tonight, and I'm excited about them being here. One of the goals of our program is to expose students to research and theories that help them understand the complex world around them, and then most importantly, to provide them with tools to take action to address the challenges we face, both within our families, communities, and between nations. I'm hoping to do something similar in this talk tonight, to identify a set of challenges and some reasons potentially for those challenges, followed by offering some suggestions for how we might move forward to meet the challenges that we share. Every day we're exposed to a stream of images that impact how we view the world around us, and extremism and violence are heavily represented in what we're exposed to. Mainstream and social media are a filter for information about the world around us, and that filter prioritizes violence and destruction. As an example, last December, worldwide attention turned to Malta, and the national and international news outlets were reporting on the hijacking of Flight 320 and the plight of the 116 passengers and crew. This event captured media and public attention around the world. But why? Why would worldwide reporting focus on this event that impacted only a few hundred people? How did the hijackers demand and receive worldwide attention? And what made this event so worthy of note? These are some of the questions that I'm going to try to take up. The Institute for Economics and Peace, working with data collected from the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism at the University of Maryland, publishes an annual index of terrorism around the globe. The most recent version of this index covers incidents of terrorism up through 2015. What their data show is that 2015 was actually the first year there was a decrease in terrorism globally since 2010. Incidences of terrorism are overwhelmingly based in 5 countries: Iraq, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Syria, which accounted for 72% of the deaths from terrorism in 2015. From this graphic, you can see the dramatic increase in global terrorism that has been associated with the Syrian civil war and the appearance of ISIS as a terrorist threat. This increased threat is built upon the rise of Boko Haram in Nigeria in the preceding years and the increases that we saw associated with that. Just a quick note on some of the terms as I'm using them. Extremism refers to an ideology or set of ideologies that are not mainstream or widely accepted within a society. There can be extremists of all kinds. Hate groups or white supremacists count as extremists, as well as groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS that we more typically label that way. But other kind of groups can be extremists as well. We've seen fringe religious groups from all kinds of religious traditions. We have environmental activist groups that don't reflect necessarily the views of the majority of society. But what brings extremism to our attention is typically when the group decides to use terrorist tactics to achieve their ends. Terrorism specifically refers to the use of violence against civilians for political gain that is calculated to create fear in the larger society. What's important about this distinction is it separates terrorism from criminal violence, and it also distinguishes it from the domestic, workplace, or school violence that we often see. While those are also horrific acts, the lack of a political motive means that they really are a different kind of event than the kinds of violence we've seen employed by ISIS and the like. And for me, as someone interested in conflict resolution, more importantly, how we would react to them is different. Dealing with criminal violence is quite different than how we need to deal with political violence. Going back to our data, 2015 was a turning point year in another respect. Deaths from terrorism in the OECD countries rose by 650% over 2014. The majority of these deaths were in France and Turkey, with 21 of the 34 OECD countries experiencing at least one terrorist attack. ISIS is responsible for much of this increase, with attacks in 28 countries. Around the globe, 23 countries reported their highest ever number of deaths from terrorism, and we have to imagine with what we saw last year that when the 2016 numbers are tabulated, this trend is going to continue. However, even with these current trends, terrorism causes nowhere near the number of deaths as many other social problems. The global homicide rate is 15 times that of deaths from terrorism, and a quick view of causes of death in the US puts the 30,000 global terrorism-related deaths in perspective. We see on the left of the chart the global deaths from terrorism in 2015 compared to motor vehicle deaths, firearm deaths, and other accidental deaths in the United States alone in the same year. So in comparison, it would seem that the threat of terrorism is less than many of the other threats to our lives. But that's certainly not the message that we're receiving in the media daily. Terrorist tactics are effective communication techniques that have strong emotional impacts on wide audiences. As part of a strategy for waging a political struggle, they are often low-cost, high-impact means of waging psychological warfare against multiple broad audiences. These tactics are not chosen solely because they're the last in the group's toolbox, but rather because they're one of the most effective of the limited tools available to lower power political groups. Fear and anger are the social power that these groups using terrorism rely on, and the ability of terrorism to build fear and demand attention from audiences larger than those personally impacted is its strength in comparison to other forms of political or social action, and that generally requires media attention to receive. The sense that everyone is vulnerable because terrorism is random and unpredictable allows fear and empathy to grow in populations who have never personally experienced terrorist violence. This narrative of random unpredictability presents terrorist tactics as opportunistic and arbitrary. That narrative, however, does not really resemble what we see in reality. In most cases, terrorist groups function like other military or paramilitary organizations. Prior to an attack, there is planning and targeting and an understanding of the goals of that particular action. They attempt to maximize the impact of their actions, and to do that, they have to maximize the media messages. Terrorist groups are also able to learn both from their own actions and the responses to them, and the actions of other groups and the responses that they observe around them. Researcher Bridget Nakos referred to this phenomena as mass-mediated terrorism. She explains in her 2007 book, and I'll quote, "The idea here is that most terrorists calculate the consequence of their deeds, the likelihood of gaining media attention, and most important, the likelihood of winning entrance through the media into what I call the triangle of political communication," unquote. For Nakos, this is particularly important in modern societies where size and complexity limit the direct communication and contact between governments and the governed. The media provide the link between the two, making modern society really media dependent. This impacts the prevalence of terrorism because groups that don't have mainstream views often have limited access to share their grievances or cause through mass media. The media is not strictly a conduit, but rather a corner in the communication triangle that can include or exclude messages and magnify or minimize the impact of political action. She sees this as important to terrorist groups who believe that well-calculated violence will open up the media gates to a variety of messages related to the incident, along with reporting on the incident itself. Committing a terrorist act prompts the attention of the news media, which by extension gets the attention of the public and the government in the affected country and abroad. Thus, for Nakos, the engaging in terrorism is a direct response to a desire for media coverage to spread political or social messages. It's important to keep in mind that most media outlets are first and foremost businesses. The expansion of social media was originally expected to dilute the power of mainstream media, but interestingly, mainstream media sources are still often the material that is being shared through social media challenges, and the mainstream media still holds a very important role in the communication structure. Media companies are looking to sell a product, and in order to bring in ad revenue, have to demonstrate that consumers are viewing their product. They have an interest in putting forward the most compelling content that they can. That will generate the maximum amount of readers and viewers. So they make decisions about what is considered newsworthy. This gatekeeping process does several things. First, it narrows down the group of newsworthy people or groups to a much smaller number. Second, it limits the types of activities that will be reported in the news. And third, the economic realities of selling the news requires a focus on novelty, excitement, familiarity, conflict, and violence, which leaves readers with unrealistic understandings of the pervasiveness of the problems being reported on. Researchers Gabrielle Weinman and Conrad Wynn did an analysis of what makes an event newsworthy and came up with 11 criteria. Groups that want to be in the news can increase their chances of being covered by playing to these factors. The first criteria is frequency. They argue that events will be newsworthy if it fits with the media production cycle. They cite an older example in the 70s and 80s of the Italian Red Brigades choosing to issue communications on Wednesdays and Saturdays because the Italian Thursday and Sunday papers had higher circulation and included more stories. They suggest that terrorist organizations manipulating the media, or attempting to, are paying attention to deadlines, schedules, and programming realities of media organizations and planning accordingly. The second criteria is threshold. This criteria requires that events pass a threshold of emotional significance. They argue that terrorist groups have very little trouble meeting this criteria because of the kinds of activities they engage in. When needed, they suggest that groups can modify their actions to ensure there is a sufficient level of injuries and deaths to ensure it meets this threshold requirement. Terrorist activities are tailor-made for media coverage because of the dramatic intensity of the events. This threshold is an easy criteria for them to achieve, but it's less easy for nonviolent actors to achieve. Their third criteria is unambiguity. The media wants events that are uncomplicated. They're easier to cover. Wyman and Wynn argue that while the underlying conditions that lead to terrorism are complicated and difficult to report, the actual terrorist acts are not. In fact, in comparison to other kinds of violence, wars, or revolutions, these events generally have a beginning and an end and can be described in just a few minutes of TV coverage or just a few columns of print. This would indicate that media are more likely to cover discrete actions than the complicated, multi-sided social conflicts that underlie the terrorist activity. The fourth criteria is meaningfulness. In practice, this means that events are more likely to be reported on if they fall within a cultural framework for understanding them. They need to fit into the stories we already tell. This is particularly relevant to terrorism in that international events are most likely to be reported if they involve nationals of the media's home country or take place on the home soil or against assets of that country. Alongside this is the fifth criteria, which is relevance, requiring an event to have an overt likeness or relevance to the nation housing the media. You can see this in the historical differences between the amount of coverage that, say, the LTTE in Sri Lanka received compared to how we have covered in the West the terrorism Israel-Palestine, which has a much clearer connection to Western countries. This criteria marches alongside meaningfulness, and many of the same factors that can make an event meaningful can make it relevant. I came across a great example of these two criteria in a discussion with Canadian journalist Melissa Fung. In 2008, while covering the conflict in Afghanistan, Melissa was captured by the Taliban and held for a month in horrifying conditions before finally being released after Afghan authorities arrested one of the kidnappers' mothers and essentially traded her freedom for Melissa's. If you're interested, she wrote a book about her experiences called Under an Afghan Sky. What interested me was that in 2013, Melissa returned to Afghanistan to do a story for Canadian news, CBC News. Her follow-up story focused on an NGO called the Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan and the education efforts and orphanage that NGO was supporting. I met her in 2014 and I asked her why that particular story. At all the events happening in Afghanistan in 2013, the planned end of NATO presence, continuous Taliban violence, why this story about the impact of a relatively small NGO? Her answer was that she had to find something connected to her local Canadian community. Even though she was reporting on events thousands of miles away, she had to connect her story to the local citizens. In order for her story to run, she had to make it meaningful in the Canadian context and relevant to the local viewers. This reality of journalism strikes me as a powerful filter that weeds out the information presented to any particular community and that can significantly impact how the public perceives events outside of their local context. Unexpectedness is Wyman and Wynn's next criteria, emphasizing events that are relatively unique, not predictable. Again, violent terrorism does well on this criteria since it almost always involves surprise. Nonviolent actions, such as negotiations or ceasefires, receive limited attention as they typically develop over a longer period of time. Scarcity as a criteria goes along with this. This implies that events should be infrequent, and when a particular kind of event becomes routine, it will lessen the amount of coverage. Terrorist groups appear to recognize this. Escalation in levels of violence or destructiveness can be a group's response to declining coverage. Meeting this criteria may obviously be the impetus between the rise of suicide bombings in the 1990s and the evolution of this tactic from one of assassination to killing large numbers of civilians. Research I've done on the appearance in conflict of females as perpetrators of violence, terrorists, indicates that one way groups can maintain a sense of the unexpected is to change who is committing the violence. We have very strong social mores about who we understand to be violent actors, and by including females, they've been able to increase the coverage. We see the counterpoint to these in the patterns of coverage of violence in Iraq and Syria over the last 10 years. What would have made international news in 2003 doesn't warrant coverage now. The violence levels are no longer unexpected. In fact, it's become quite routine. The continuity criteria indicates that once a type of event has been deemed newsworthy, other events of that type are likely to be covered as well. Wyman and Wynn talk about how for international terrorism, this explains the occurrence of contagion, the idea that terrorism can spread from one extremist group to another when they perceive it's achieved positive results. Tying together the current action with past meaningful actions can increase the likelihood of continuing coverage. Probably the strongest of their requirements they identify was personification. And their quote here is that the strongest requirement for news production, because it is the strongest requirement for news production, because it fulfills so many of the professional requirements of the newsroom, unquote. They argue that events that can be explained in terms of people rather than social processes make it easier for the audience to identify with and are easier for journalists to explain as well as to practically produce. Personification also allows the media to portray a story as a morality play, with good characters and bad characters, and to communicate strong human emotions. We also find that reference to elite nations and elite individuals also make a story more likely to be covered. The media prefers news about important people, so terrorist groups have employed strategies to take advantage of this. We've seen historically that assassinations and kidnappings of government officials, athletes, business and entertainment leaders, these staged events that make reference to elite individuals, have been a long-term strategy of terrorist groups. The final criteria is destructiveness, and this is probably obvious. Destructive events are more likely to receive news coverage, partly because they fulfill so many of the other criteria, including frequency, unambiguity, and scarcity. Destructive events come in manageable chunks to portray and are usually relatively quick to describe. These negative events can be seen easily in terms of good versus bad and fall easily into terms of personification. While the destructiveness alone contributes to coverage, the level of destruction also plays a part. Past experience with media coverage shows terrorism meeting the criteria of newsworthiness better than many other kinds of social or political action. If terrorism is about a political group engaging in communication with an audience, then using terrorist tactics increases the chance of success in getting their message covered. Wyman and Wynn went on to test their variables, looking for the strongest predictors of news coverage. Their study found patterns in what was covered and what was not covered in both newspapers and television that matched what they'd identified. They found that doing harm doubles the probability of an event being covered. Low levels of coverage for nonviolent events and high levels of coverage for violent events indicate to them that there's a built-in incentive for groups to engage in violence in order to have grievances heard. Getting access to that triangle of communication by using violence allows extremist groups to increase their profile and amplify their message. Their coverage by mass media outlets obliges mass audiences to witness fearful situations and allows for the spread of fear beyond those immediately impacted. Violence forces governments and publics to hear and contemplate terrorist demands and to ask why. Why are they doing that? Groups can maintain themselves in the news through stretching out or repeating these violent events, and we've seen that violence by one group can encourage others to imitate in a contagion effect. What we've just discussed points out how tailor-made terrorist attacks are for gaining the attention and focus of mainstream media outlets, and through access to the triangle of communication to have impact on the public as well as policymakers. But we haven't yet discussed what or how media actually cover those attacks. Does it matter how they're covered? In the media account, details about the victim, perpetrator, and circumstances can impact how an audience perceives the violent action. In research looking at the semantic structure of a newspaper account, Karen Cerullo developed a framework to compare the structure with the moral messages that they imply. She identified several kinds of violence, natural disasters, self-defense, sports, and war violence as examples of normal or normalized violence that society generally accepts. She identified criminal murder, assault, racial attacks, and terrorism as examples of deviant violence. The intention of the perpetrator, as well as the magnitude of force they use, are also factors in labeling the event as normal or deviant. Personal gain motivations are more likely to be labeled deviant than motivations involved in redressing injustice. Because the media serve as a filter for the content of the reports, the media has control over many of the variables that affect how violence is perceived. Following Cerullo's logic, accounts that focus on the terrorist attack as a mechanism to redress injustice or defend against perceived or actual threats would be considered less evil than accounts that do not mention these motivations. Media accounts that emphasize the acts as a means to achieve political or economic control would be considered more evil. The context of the event is also important. The circumstances that provoked the event, the consequences of the attack, characteristics of the victim, these all serve as cues for moral labeling of violence. The identity of the victims can impact the social story that the attack activates. An attack against military installations or personnel activates a story about warfare and implies legitimate violence. Attacks against innocent victims are likely to prompt a story of illegitimate, deviant violence. She notes that the order in which information is presented is one mechanism by which reporters pass on to the audience their own understandings of the legitimacy of violence. She found that the actual sequence of when we encounter actors in the media accounts are not random. Instead, her quote, rather strong cultural conventions linked to the narrator's perceptions of audience morality, lead storytellers to systematically invoke particular sequences at different times, unquote. These conventions are not conscious for the journalists. Journalists reported to Cerullo that each account they wrote or presented was unique and that they created their story based on the facts of the case. She found, however, that there was distinct, consistent ways in which unacceptable acts, justifiable acts, and ambiguous acts were portrayed. Essentially, it matters who the journalist opens the story with, whose shoes the rest of the story will be seen from. I'll use some examples from my research on media coverage of terrorism in Northern Ireland, Israel, Palestine, and the Caucasus to illustrate her theory. I've done research on these cases because they're strong examples of the kinds of intractable, ethnically based conflicts that have both violent and non-violent actors at work in them, and I've been able to compare the coverage. Stories that begin with introducing the victim sequences, were in her study consistently associated with deviant violence, or our understanding of violence as deviant. The readers view the events through the eyes of the victim. That's where they enter. An example of this sequence is the first 2 paragraphs from a Jerusalem Post story about a Palestinian rocket attack in 2003. It begins, 4 Israelis were lightly wounded Wednesday night by an anti-tank rocket fired at them from the Gaza Strip. The wounded were treated at the scene before being taken to the hospital. Palestinians earlier fired 2 mortar shells at settlements and a nearby IDF position, narrowly missing homes, unquote. The reader in this account has entered the story through the perspective of the victims. Information about the perpetrator doesn't arrive until later. Cerullo argues that the moral message being transmitted to the reader is that the violence was illegitimate and that the victim, in this case, should be the emphasis. In contrast, performer sequences bring the reader in through the violent actor's eyes by prioritizing information about them. Performer sequences, she found in her research, are typically associated with violence that society would consider normal or justifiable. This Irish Times story from 1993 exposes us first to the IRA. Quote, widespread condemnation has followed the IRA's killing of a young policeman in a crowded city street in Derry on Saturday afternoon. The killing has interrupted a long period of relative peace in the city, unquote. Even though this violence would be considered by most deviant, the perspective introduced first is that of the IRA. The news here is presented in a pattern that is normally associated with legitimate violence in stories about all other kinds of events. For the reader, she believes this variation between content and structure would be heard and understood and interpreted by the reader as ambiguity about the legitimacy of this violence. Contextual sequences focus the reader's attention on the setting or circumstances of the event, and double casting sequences place the performer as both the victim and the perpetrator by focusing on the current event as well as past victimization. Contextual or double casting sequences correlate with violence that is morally ambiguous, and it's hard for the reader to understand what the moral message should be. The first 2 paragraphs of this New York Times story from 1999 begin the story with information on the context, not the victims. In fact, this presentation feels almost like reporting on an unavoidable natural disaster. The actual violence is downplayed compared to the contextual information. So here's the quote. A fresh flood of Chechen refugees swept westward today down the main highway into Ingushetia, the neighboring republic propelled by fear of a widening war with Russia after explosions killed scores in Grozny, Chechen's capital. A day after the blast flattened a downtown market and destroyed a car carrying 5 passengers, English officials said 3,000 more Chechens had arrived, which raised the count to 185,000, unquote. Cerullo found the sequences were consistently applied to different types of violence. The deviant violent acts, criminal assault and criminal murder, were presented more than 3/4 of the time in victim sequences. Normal violence, capital punishment, natural disasters, self-defense, were presented overwhelmingly in performer sequences. More ambiguous events were portrayed reliably as contextual or in double-cast sequences. She concluded that the sequence of presentation was a function of the moral judgment the storyteller had made about the legitimacy of the violence, essentially who to prioritize. But when it comes to terrorism and racial attacks, which she obviously labeled as deviant, the pattern is nowhere near as clear. Terrorist attacks were presented about as often in performer sequences as victim sequences. This means that almost half the time, terrorist attacks are presented in the style of legitimate violence, and that emphasize the perpetrators, not the victims. It also indicates that terrorism is unique in its ability to force media focus on the perpetrators of violence, as opposed to the victims. I'll speak a little bit later about the way this may connect with the increase in school shootings we've seen in the United States, but the unique ability of terrorism to provide focus on the actors may be a factor which leads groups to choose terrorism as a strategy. This factor is increased when the perpetrators of violence are female. My research indicates that when women are the perpetrators, they're presented increasingly in performer sequences, as reporters focus on what is considered unusual, the presence of women as violent actors, instead of solely as victims. This phenomenon of women being treated differently in media coverage was highlighted for me by an article about the arrest of Chechen separatists by Russian security forces reported in the TASS newswire. The article is describing the stop of a car with 4 people in it, one of whom was wearing a suicide vest. Of the 4, 3 were men and 1 was a woman, with the woman wearing the vest. The article read, quote, "The 3 terrorists and the woman," unquote. I thought to myself, what more does she need to do to be considered a terrorist? Her gender remained the emphasis, even when she was the one most clearly engaged in terrorist activity. The different treatment of women in these media stories, I believe, is an advantage to violent extremist groups. By recruiting and using women as violent actors, they engage the audiences much more directly in trying to answer the why did they do it question. And that allows for a group's message and cause to be discussed in that triangle of communication. The tenor and sequence of media accounts matters because it provides cues to the audience regarding the moral standing of the action. The meaning attached to the facts through the content or sequence of the media accounts can impact the public's perception and then what they're asking of government. Differences in media accounts may activate different social stories about an event. These stories are hinted at by Cirillo's categorization of normal, abnormal, deviant, and ambiguous violence. A social understanding about normal or acceptable violence indicates that acts of violence are sanctioned by society, such as self-defense, violent sports, and warfare, and don't need to be punished as crimes. They don't break laws, nor are the perpetrators of these acts of violence morally accountable for their actions. This discourse leads to the lack of, or very light sentences for actions that fall within the social discourse of normal violence. Deviant violence, that falls outside what we consider acceptable in society, such as murders, coercive violence, and unprovoked violence attacks, activates a story about deviance, and these perpetrators are sentenced more harshly within the criminal justice system. Not only are the actions considered monstrous, but often the people committing them are seen as possessing some characteristic or characteristics that make them abnormal or evil people. Ambiguous violence is not just the gray area in between, but actions that activate both social stories. Ambiguous violence has elements of the abnormal and normal violence. While a drunk driver can be seen as taking a life through unprovoked violence, his actions are not generally considered evil, but instead negligent. But when circumstances indicate that that individual is a habitual offender, the discourse of abnormal violence is activated, and we categorize that individual as abnormal. This ambiguity shows up in the wide range of sentences that we see imposed for actions that fall within these complicated categories. Cirillo notes that terrorism often is presented in ways that make it appear to be ambiguous violence. There's not clear moral messages. Often the terrorist can be presented as both the victim and the perpetrator, as when the trauma or loss they've experienced in their life is presented as an explanation for their current violent behavior. The ambiguity is also displayed when the social conditions around them are the lead part of the story. This sequence or moral message is an important element for the terrorist group. It would appear that receiving coverage that follows patterns of normal or ambiguous violence would be a better outcome for an extremist group than coverage that identifies it as deviant violence. Several social metaphors circulate about terrorism. We talk about it as just another form of warfare, terrorism as a weapon of the weak, terrorism as a religious imperative, terrorism as an evil force in the world. Media presentation cues the viewer which of these metaphors to interpret the current event with. Each of these metaphors falls into a different part of the spectrum between normal and abnormal violence, and this variation may explain why terrorism is presented with such ambiguity in our media accounts. Both the gatekeeping function, where media determine what is worthy of coverage, and story structure influence how useful media coverage is to share the causes or concerns of extremist groups. This leads to a question of what now? If we know there's a phenomena of mass-mediated terrorism, what are we to do about it? How do we break the cycle? One option might be hinted at some of the conversations about media coverage that are happening in the context of school shootings in the United States. Just a little background about the history of school shootings. The epidemic, and I think it counts as that, started with the Columbine attacks in 1999. Where with a combination of guns and explosives, 2 high school students killed 13 classmates and teachers and injured 21 more before committing suicide before they could be captured. The perpetrators, whose names I won't say, became household names in the US, with documentaries and feature stories peering into their lives to understand why they would do this. It was a media coup. The perpetrators weren't alive to see it, but their legacy was weeks and months of coverage of their actions, families, histories, and grievances. According to ABC News, between 1999 and 2016, 65 school shooters, or thwarted school shooters, cited the Columbine attacks as a motivation for their own violence. There has been a scourge of unhappy, sometimes mentally ill, young, mostly men, who've turned their anger at society against the schools they grew up in or were connected to, and the innocent lives of the students inhabiting them. According to the FBI, since Columbine, there have been 50 mass murders in the United States, or attempted mass murders in schools, resulting in at least 141 casualties, all of which have had a massive media coverage and significant coverage specifically of the perpetrators and their lives and grievances. Everyone wants to know why. Why would they take innocent lives? If we think back to our statistics at the beginning of this talk, 141 casualties really doesn't seem that high. We have many more people die of car crashes and in other ways. But this case, and I think the relationship of media coverage and public response, I think is helpful for thinking about how we respond and cover terrorist activities. What's important about the case of school shootings is there appears to be a clear connection between the media coverage and notoriety school shootings and shooters receive and the decision processes by other, in this case, unstable young men to engage in a public rampage that targets the most vulnerable in society, our children. There is a clear pathway to fame. There is a clear pathway to fame. Notoriety, sure, but fame nonetheless. The advent of these patterns caused soul searching among the media. The advent of these patterns caused soul searching among the media about what the role should be that media coverage is playing and how it might be incentivizing this kind of violence, and some quite interesting conversations about how to respond. Media outlets in the US are openly shifting from talking about the perpetrators to only focusing on the victims, shifting the focus from those who do violence to those who are impacted by it. As I did earlier, media outlets are increasingly concerned about even giving voice to the names of the perpetrators, and there's been moves to eliminate saying the names of perpetrators in coverage. There's clearly no perfect answer, but the emphasis in this conversation of thinking critically about how media coverage can impact events in the world is a good sign. I'm curious if we can have similar conversations about how our media cover extremists, particularly those who have chosen to use terrorist tactics. There are clearly no perfect answers to how we deal with the connection between violence and media coverage in democratic societies in which freedom of the press is valued. We have to respond to the public's right to know. What we can do is, as media consumers, is recognize our role as the purchasers and consumers of media that emphasizes violence and might incentivize terrorist activity. But this isn't about censorship. Picard, in his book about media coverage of terrorism, argues that reducing or eliminating coverage could actually increase the level of violence that terrorist groups use, or increase the anxiety within the public because there's a lack of knowledge about why events are happening. He says, and I quote, "An important school of thought suggests that media coverage might well be used to reduce the possibility of further violent action by removing the need for groups to resort to violence in order to gain attention. Thus, denying access might increase violence," unquote. He points to a task force on terrorism and disorders who suggested that the news media provide more as opposed to less coverage, and said that, again, I quote, "If such coverage avoided glamorizing the perpetrators of violence, provided reliable information, and gave appropriate emphasis to the consequences of violence, coverage would increase public understanding, reduce fear, and assist in reducing violence," unquote. Recognizing the challenges this standpoint faces, he notes that while opening the media to the currently excluded makes sense, the realities of what the public demands and the media industry probably make this unlikely. In democratic societies that value freedom of the press, these persistent patterns in media coverage are problematic as governments and publics attempt to address the issue of terrorism. The system, as it exists, allows access to the public discourse, the triangle of communication, to those who choose to violently protest grievance, and all too often denies access to those pursuing redress of grievances nonviolently. Taken at the macro level, when the response to violence is, why did they do this? Journalists are rewarding terrorist groups with coverage of their grievances and cause. A focus on the victims and specific elements of the event decreases the power of media coverage to help terrorist groups pass on their message. and continues to portray a message of it being illegitimate violence. Using what we've seen with school shootings, the incentive structure is shifting very, very slowly for mass murderers in the U.S. As a strategy, a similar shift in coverage of terrorism may change the balance and the logic of using terrorism as a means of communication, which is fundamentally what it is. This may provide a strategy that respects the independence of media outlets to choose what makes the news, but lessens the media rewards for violence. If this could be coupled with, as Picard suggests, increased coverage of groups that are pursuing change nonviolently, the power of violence to send a message could decrease. Obviously, this would require the voluntary participation of media outlets and the participation of the media consuming public to demand change in what we expect to view. These are fundamental and hard choices for democracies that value freedom of the press, but also want to address continued levels of violence. I'd be happy to take some questions or thoughts that anyone might have, and I appreciate your time. How do you want to handle that? Sorry.
I think we thank Dr. Shed. I, for one, will never listen or read the news in the same way again for this very thought-provoking and interesting lecture. Dr. Shed's very kindly agreed to take questions. I would ask you please to identify yourselves and keep your question as short or comment as short as possible. Would anyone like to ask any questions?
I've answered them all.
Yeah, probably. There's always a little lull before people get going. Yes, okay, we have a gentleman there. There's a microphone there, please, because we're recording this. Thank you. Okay.
Good evening.
Hi.
My name is Ahmed Shimbish.
Nice to meet you.
I am the chairman of the Libya Foundation for Rehabilitation. I am from Benghazi. My wife from Tripoli. We live here and we watch the news every day. We are frustrated. The national, regional, and international news manipulating us and frustrating. We don't know whom to believe. So the media, as I said, coverage either on the national level, regional level, or international level, they are not giving the truth. So we are confused, frustrated, what to believe. And this is one of the, I think, the bad side of the media.
Yeah. I think one of the complicating factors is actually trying to identify whose truth we're covering. So many of these conflicts and issues are such complicated social conflicts with underlying conditions and histories that have gone on forever that the idea of whose truth is really hard to get to. I saw an interesting, I don't know if anybody else saw this, the Wall Street Journal put something out right before the U.S. inauguration, so about 3 weeks ago, and it was a really interesting, and you can go on their website right now and find it, but it was really interesting because what it did is it tracked the history of conservative and liberal social media feeds in the United States side by side. So if you wanted to look at an issue like immigration or like taxes, you could go in and see what social media from the conservative side versus social media from the liberal side were saying. And it looked like we lived in an entirely different country from each other, right? I mean, they didn't match at all. So I think we have really interesting conversations to have about how do we bring back some of that to having a collective truth, a shared story? How can we bring it, how do we vet those things? You know, we've been hearing a lot about fake news and other kinds of things. How do we provide the vetting for that? But I think this idea of trying to come back to some kind of shared story where we might have some shared understanding of what the requirements are for something to be considered truth is really important.
Eric from Movement Graffiti. I wanted to ask, do you agree that maybe the problem is that corporate media is owned a lot by one person?
Interesting. You know, I think that journalists feel like they work pretty independently and have a lot of sway. I'm not sure that downstream the ownership of the actual organization is as important as the level of like the editor who's actually making decisions about what's going to go or not go. And I think that those decisions may reflect somewhat the ideology of the owner of the media, but I think also reflect an understanding of what's going to sell, more importantly, right? Because that's fundamentally what they're responsible for, is coming up with something that's going to sell, that they're going to get viewers, they're going to get readers. So, yeah, I mean, I think we have to pay attention to that, and clearly media outlets vary, you know, based on which side of a political spectrum they come down on. But I think it's really more to the editor's level that I see place that we can make change.
Hello, Noel, general public. I would like just to add another comment why the media, maybe it's better for them to cover more. Because if we look at an article called On Defense of Yahya by Aref, which it theologically explains why in Islam it's permissible to blow yourself, but depending on criteria. And one of the criteria is on the expansion of Islam. So if terrorism now it's giving it a bad name, more coverage will give it a bad name and go against the intent, and therefore it will annul. Their intention to make Islam better will actually not be good. Thank you.
I think one of the big
I made myself clear.
I think one of the big distinctions in what we see in coverage is whether or not things are covered as episodically, or whether they're covered as themes. And one of the fairly consistent trends is that terrorist activity is pretty much always covered as a particular episode. So again, this like beginning, middle, and end, we can tell a story and encapsulate it. Much more rarely is it covered in a more thematic sense, where we could see trends that might be coming through, or where we're really looking at underlying conditions and structures. I think that's what you're pointing to, about more coverage that kind of describes more.
For the benefit of Islam.
Yeah.
And since the intent is for the benefit of Islam, and by coverage, Islam will not benefit, then of course they cannot do it, because then their intent will not be good.
So you're thinking about kind of a re-education through media coverage?
No, it's because if they realize that by committing terrorists, then the name of Islam will not be in a good light, then of course, then they say, theologically, they cannot do it.
So I think this goes to the point of making sure that in our coverage, we're consistent about delegitimizing that violence, right? That it isn't a legitimate response to grievance, or it's not going to get where they want to go.
No, it's just the coverage is enough.
Yeah.
Because the public opinion go against it.
Yeah. Okay.
And therefore the aims of the act will not be fulfilled. Actually, it will be countered.
Thanks. Pete.
I'd like to know whether there's more we can do as individuals to encourage the kind of peace journalism which you were indicating in some of your lecture. Thank you.
You know, I think we can reward it when we see it, and give feedback back to media organizations that that's the kind of journalism we'd like to see. I also would really like to see us asking for and demanding more coverage of nonviolent groups. So in each of the conflicts that I've done research on, there are significant numbers of nonviolent groups who are pursuing the grievances of the larger community, but really the only ones we hear about are the people engaging in violence. So I think asking for, prompting it, asking questions about it, trying to get the messages of the nonviolent groups into the larger sphere, I think is part of what we can do as consumers, so that we're rewarding that from the business sense as well, right? That's what we're buying. You were there.
Sharon Attad from the President's Foundation. I just wanted to pick up on your last point about media as business and wonder if you had any thoughts of movements like the Stop Funding Hate movement that we're seeing sort of rising in the UK, and whether there's more that can be done in terms of appealing to the business sense of different media organizations, and whether kind of there's more that can be done from the media as an outlet for advertising and so on, and sort of what role you see that playing.
Yeah. So I have quite a few colleagues that are actually engaged in trying to do training with journalists, so that it's not a matter of legislating, but actually working together to say how would we do this differently? How do we match the business imperatives with what would be more likely to actually emphasize peace journalism, right? What does that look like? And so I think that part of it is doing the research, right? Being able to actually show that we have some patterns, so that it's not, I think most often we're in the moment and we're assuming that what's happening is unique. But if we can actually demonstrate that we have patterns, we can demonstrate connections. I think that kind of evidence base to go back and do training with, or to just explore and share, is one way to kind of say, how might we match these up? You know, what are the mechanisms in which we can make this good business, good media business, as well as promoting peace? Oh, got one. Just coming from behind.
Hi, I'm Jessie. I'm a master's student at UAM. I had a question about whether peace journalism sells, because you responded to the question about whether the owners matter, and you said, actually, I think it's about what sells that matters.
Yeah.
So I was curious about whether you think peace journalism sells.
You know, that's a good question, and one that I don't think I have a really simple answer to, or easy answer to. I think it probably varies a lot, society to society, and also based on probably the political leaning of the people consuming that particular media. But I haven't done any research on it, so I don't have a really easy answer.
Hi, my name is Hamid. I am part of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat community in Malta, and I just want to ask a question about regarding the basis of terrorism in religion. We know that the definition of terrorism, you know, there's no particular religion associated with it. So why is it that, for example, an Islamist extremist is called a terrorist, whereas just recently, you know, the shooting in Quebec City was by a white Christian, and that wasn't portrayed as being terrorism. It was a lone wolf or a mentally unstable person, or etc. So, do you agree with that? And
yeah, I think these are.
Why is it that way?
Yeah, these are really hard. These are really hard questions, and I've been struggling recently with the idea of how do we categorize some of the lone wolf attacks, for instance, in the United States. I was actually at a conference that was working on challenging extremism in colleges and universities, and someone from the Southern Poverty Law Center was there. And I don't know if that's an organization that's familiar to you all, but in the United States, it's a watchdog group that actually looks at hate speech across a variety of different spectrums and tries to identify where there's the potential for violence or harm, right, and to bring those things forward. And one of the things that they were concluding was that what they were seeing was a really alarming rise in hate speech from white supremacist groups, right? And that I'm really concerned. I think there is real concern that that's actually may well be one of the sources of a lot more violence in the future, as opposed to anti or religious-based violence, right? But this kind of hate speech might promote that. And I think the question you're asking is really good and really hard, which is that it is much easier to label someone who doesn't look like you with a name that denotes something evil, right? It's a lot harder to do that with somebody that looks a lot like you and that you can understand. And that doesn't make it right, and it doesn't make it fair. But I think that that's what we're seeing. Now, that being said, you know, this is a particular wave, I think, where worldwide attention is focused on Islamic terrorism. In the 1990s, what I was hearing about, most of what we talked about was like the IRA, right? Or other kinds of terrorist groups that weren't necessarily attached to a particular religious organization. So I also think we need to recognize that we're in a particular period of time. with looking at the graph, this real impact of what the Syrian civil war has done in terms of destabilizing and allowing non-state armed groups to be really active and have a base of support. So we don't use definitions consistently. Even governments don't use definitions consistently. It's quite political to decide who is going to be, which groups and organizations will be labeled as terrorist groups or not. And I think we have to understand that as a political process, even if we don't agree with the outcome. So I don't think that's necessarily a happy message or a solution, but.
Hi, my name is Miriam, and I'm a journalist. My question is, we have heard, a lot about media focusing on what sells. My question is, should media consumers actually start thinking that news should be paid for? You mentioned that there's perhaps what readers want to read is not represented in the newspaper. So whilst reducing the dependency on the private interests, what about media consumers paying for what they want to read and do not, move away the moment that the newspaper raises the price or we introduce a subscription?
I think that's one of the changes that I think is contributed to this cycle is that media have so much less budget for the kind of in-depth reporting that I think would be useful around some of these issues, right? I mean, it really is, as consumers have continued to put pressure on the news media industry by not buying the subscriptions, right? By everything going online and getting their media or getting their news from Facebook and Twitter versus a media outlet. That resource base and the decline in the resource base to do the kind of in-depth reporting, I think, has been really important and is contributing to the kind of surface level understanding that I think we, for the most part, have been getting to. So I don't know how you undo that, right? I don't know how you undo the technology by which people are often finding out something happened through a friend who lived in that city and posted something online. I don't know how we undo that, but I do think it's a real challenge for us. Is that if we're not putting the resources in, how do we expect there to be people with the time and the skill and the expertise to ferret in and figure out what's going on in some of these conflicts?
Hello, I'm Tim. I'm a journalist as well. I think what hasn't been spoken about enough over here is the fact that mainstream media organizations are no longer the sole gatekeepers of information. And if a news outlet chooses out of ethics or morals not to report a particular story, it is either going to be picked up by somebody else, another news organization, perhaps a website. It's going to permeate to the general public regardless. In that case, it should be the media's job to report it. I think also, in my opinion, this whole linking the rate of terrorism to the amount of media coverage is an attempt to try and give some sort of structure to terrorism when the truth is that it's something that is completely unforeseeable, unpredictable, and random, and that is exactly what they feed off of. And I think trying to feed it, to link it to the rate of media coverage is, I don't think it holds much water. And what do you think about that?
I don't actually agree with you. I think it's strategic. I think it's planned. I think terrorist organizations learn. I think there's cycles of feedback that they get. So let me give you an example. The very first female suicide bomber in Israel-Palestine may well have been an accident. She may have just been carrying the backpack for her brother, to meet her brother. Her name is Wafa Idris. Immediately after her bomb went off in I believe it was a drugstore, no one claimed any responsibility for it. And I think there was kind of a collective breath holding about whether people were going to think that a woman engaged in this violence was too much, if it was too far. Interestingly, the public in the Palestinian public that was supportive of violence came out and applauded this action. And fairly quickly, Fatah claimed responsibility for her doing this and claimed it to be strategic. And after that, we saw Yasser Arafat actually come out and give a speech that called for his army of roses, right? For more women to join the cause as suicide bombers. I think it was strategic. I think it was in response to something he saw and he liked about how the public reacted to what they did. that doesn't make it right. That doesn't make it not malevolent. Like understanding and being able to predict it doesn't make any of it okay. But I think there are patterns that we can find. And if we're not looking for the patterns, we're not going to be able to figure out how to undermine them. I think your comment about the mass media versus the other sources of information is really spot on. I was watching the coverage on, and even the mass media using other sources of information, I think is interesting. So I was watching the coverage on CNN of the aftermath of the shooting of the police officers in Dallas. I don't know if that made news here at all. But what I found so fascinating was that as opposed to having a professional journalist reporting, they were showing the cell phone videos being taken by people staying in a hotel that were just pointing their, camera out the window and taking the cell phone video. And this was now the source information for CNN to report on this attack. And it struck me how little filter there was in that, right? And that in some way that CNN had given up the agency to be any kind of filter or to edit that to this person that they had no idea what they were going to say, holding this camera up to the window, in this Dallas hotel room. And I thought that was really interesting and really kind of fundamentally problematic, but I'm not sure what we do about it. Because again, if we have this decrease in resources, right, and there's not the people to go out and actually do the reporting on the ground, there's more reliance on what's being generated from the public, from the masses. I do think, however, that there's a very good role that mass media can play to make sure that they're providing accurate information. So I can go on my Facebook feed and probably find evidence to support any opinion I want to have, right? Somebody out there is going to be showing some kind of evidence or making a statement that I could support it. What we need mass media to do are be the places that people can go to say, I heard this crazy rumor online. I heard this really weird, and this doesn't quite seem right to me. And that they can go and actually get factual information. I think people are still looking for that. So I think there's an awareness that we're being flooded with a lot of, just a lot of junk. Just, a lot of things that aren't true or aren't wholly true or someone's take. And I think the role that media can continue to play, even with all these other information sources, is making sure that we do have places to go where we can get factual information presented by professional reporters and journalists who have and follow the ethics that is such a strong trend in the journalist profession. So I don't know if that answers it, but at least as a response.
Just one more, please. Really, thank you. Okay.
Hi, I'm John. I'm a philosophy student at the University of Malta. Right now, a very hot topic is post-truth politics, and alternative fact. Given the current political situation, of course, I was hoping it would come up before I had to actually stand. What is your take on this phenomenon, and especially, of course, in relation to the way extremism is portrayed to the public?
I'm really troubled by it. I'm actually kind of horrified by the state right now of public conversation in my country and the extent to which we are not able to engage productively with any kind of around any kind of shared truth, right? Like that really right now what is being debated is the veracity of someone else's truth versus the issue at hand, right? So we're spending all of our time denouncing what someone else is saying is the case, as opposed to actually working on what we might do about the issues as they're being raised. I don't think this is a surprise. I think that the advent of social media and the extent that we can diffuse and the extent that we can live in our own bubbles, right? And you never actually have to be exposed to anybody that disagrees with you. Particularly not ever have to be exposed to anybody that disagrees with you, someplace that you can't say something nasty anonymously. So we are not requiring the skill sets of being able to actually discuss with people who don't think like us in respectful ways about issues. We've moved it all into the online space where it's a free-for-all. So I think it's troubling, and I don't have an answer. I think there's a lot of space for the conflict resolution, peace-building community to be figuring out how to do this. I'm working with local library near us, my county library, and we're trying to create a series of trainings for youth and adults that do two things. The librarians are going to talk about information literacy and where do you get information and how do you vet sources and what does that look like and how do you do research. And then the conflict people are going to come in and talk about how do we talk about things we don't agree on. So if we found the information, how can we use reliable information to have a debate about important topics that we need to address and we don't agree with? It's going to be a really small scale, right? It's going to be a drop in the bucket compared to the problem of what we have going on and the inability to talk to each other and even agree on basic basic facts about what's going on. But I think it's a start. And I think that movements like that and folks that have skill in hosting conversation, have skill in doing research, have skill in ferreting out sources, are going to be really important resources for all of us to try to kind of change the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being such a participative audience. Well, it would have been a huge shame to miss out on asking questions to such an able expert who's given us the benefit of her knowledge. I'd just like to remind you, before we thank her properly, that the foundation, the President's Foundation for the Wellbeing of Society, has an event coming up on Friday, which is a commemoration, a memorial of Holocaust. Should have been last week, but we were busy doing a conference last week. And we have 3 Holocaust survivors who will be sharing their experiences with us. We're already quite oversubscribed, but if anyone's interested, please get in touch. It's an amazing opportunity to listen to 3 people who've gone through experiences which we've read about, but which our young people were quite surprised at. So this is why they're coming out. They're coming out, they're going to meet with nearly 1,000 school children across Malta and Gozo and give a public session in the palace Friday at 6 o'clock. Please join me in thanking Dr. Julie Shedd. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. There are drinks. Please join us for a drink. Thank you.